Welcome to NatCon Squad. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We have a great show lined up today. We're going to talk about the deep state first. We're going to talk about Ron DeSantis's new attacks on big tech. We're going to talk about a deeply weird piece of journalism from Time magazine that reflected on how the elites prevented what they wanted, what they did not want to have happen in the 2020 election. And we're going to talk about the departure of religion from our civic life. With that said, I'm going to kick it over to Ben right off the bat here to talk about the deep state.
Thanks, Emily. There's been a lot of heated rhetoric of late around the need to deprogram Americans, to de-Bathify the American public of their wrong-thinking views, namely their support of President Trump. And as well, references to Americans as insurrectionists, seditionists, and even domestic terrorists. There's even been calls to drone them on cable television. Given that state of affairs, it would be one thing to dismiss this as just heated rhetoric, but it's another thing when you have former national security and intelligence officials, the most senior ones, talking about actual need for counterinsurgency against Americans and referring to Americans as essentially equivalent to Al-Qaeda. They never really define specifically who they're talking about. They use vague phrases like domestic violent extremists, or they say white supremacists, which has a clearer definition. But then again, in this current age where the left defines the terms, well, look, even the classics have been classified as potential tools of white supremacy in the New York Times lately. Even scarier than the rhetoric is the fact that it does appear the Biden administration is moving on this. And even before the January 6th Capitol riots, which have been used as a catalyst to put forth this effort, there were reports that the administration was considering a basically war on domestic terrorism. In a January 22nd press briefing, Press Secretary Jen Psaki laid out this three-part effort, which is going to involve essentially using all the tools of the national security, law enforcement, and intelligence apparatus, coordinated by the National Security Council, to pursue this war on domestic violent extremists. This has ramifications for our civil liberties. This has ramifications for our ability to exist as a nation, in particular because we don't know why this effort is merited in terms of the supposed threat of DVE, domestic violent extremism. We don't know who the administration specifically is targeting. We don't know what laws they're going to run up against in trying to execute this. We do know that they've fingered big tech as potentially the area in which they will exert pressure on American speech and try to police us. Given that context, the heated environment that we're in, and the potential of a global war on terror brought home to America and targeting Americans, this should be the issue, in my view, that the political class is grappling with, that our leaders should be defending us against, investigating, providing oversight on, and exploring. So let me tip it off first to Josh. Josh, what do you make of the legal ramifications and then the implications for every American of a Biden administration pursuing a war on domestic violent extremism, so-called?
You know, Ben, I think back to a line that my friend Daniel Horowitz, formerly of Conservative Review, now at The Blaze, said many years ago, where he has oftentimes excoriated our military strategy overseas. And what Daniel has said is, he says, our generals are actually more political than politicians themselves. I mean, look at David Petraeus. David Petraeus is a perfect example of this. Is a golden boy PhD who was effectively now sold out with his current private equity perch, him, Stanley McChrystal. These are people who have come up through the true capitalist system in kind of the truest sense of the term. And what is being mouthed off by people for whom, lots of soldiers, Marines, cadets, midshipmen, et cetera, looked up to for guidance on the battlefields, for that kind of level of respect, to speak with that kind of purported authority, the way that many of our military elites are now talking now, it ought to be genuinely harrowing. You know, I think a lot of us kind of like metaphorically spoke about kind of the ruling class's war on the deplorables. It increasingly seems like that metaphor is going to be pretty real. I mean, this really it ought to unite everyone who is not kind of an illiberal far leftist, in my opinion. I mean, to the extent that kind of left liberals, you know, the Barry Weiss of the world, to the extent they have any, I'm not singling out Barry, obviously, with people like her, the extent kind of liberals in the true sense have any sort of integrity whatsoever, this ought to be kind of nipped in the bud. But look, Rachel, you talk so prolifically about kind of Senate GOP incompetence and the fact that Republicans don't know how to rebut these sort of over aggressive posturing from the far left. So, I mean, do you think that there's any chance that Republicans can actually stand up meaningfully against this?
Well, it used to be, to your point, liberals, right, who actually cared about civil rights here and actually would say, no, hold on, all those drone strikes that we did overseas, probably shouldn't do those here in the US. But it's almost like we've reversed it. You have the left now calling for this totally totalitarian behavior here at home. But, I'm not confident that the Republican Party can firmly stand against this, because rhetorically, they just seem to be flailing a little bit. They don't know how to deal with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're trying to condemn her and kick her off her committees instead of actually grappling with, and I think this goes to the larger point, and we mentioned this a little bit last time, of why there's people believing this in the first place, right? The people now calling for drone striking Americans for gathering at a MAGA rally are complicit in the fact that people don't trust our institutions. There's a massive institutional failure that's led to this kind of thinking. I don't think it's actually as widespread as people think it is, as these people are making it out to be, but it's there. And it's because people don't trust the government. It's because people don't trust our institutions, and our media institutions. And there's a lot of blame to go around there. But this is the time for Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, to stand up and say, this is crazy. This is actually crazy. We are talking about making war on our fellow Americans. We're talking about an ideological purity test for the military. We saw this when I think the National Guard troops that were stationed here in DC, I think 2 or 3 of them, or maybe more, were removed from duty because they had a Facebook post that didn't meet sort of the narrative that was deemed appropriate. This is crazy. This is against pluralism. This is against democracy. This is against everything that our free society is based upon. So look, Republicans are facing their own irrelevance in so many ways. And I think this is one of them. This is even if it has to be self-interested, even if they're fighting for their own electoral survival, I think now would be the time. But Emily, I know you've talked a lot about, sort of failure of institutions kind of in this way as well. So I'm wondering if you have any kind of thoughts on this too.
Matt Stoller tweeted just this morning, and Matt's sort of an economic populist coming from the left. He tweeted this morning that the primary tension on the left is between economic populists and HR liberals, basically. And I think that's really interesting because, as Ben mentioned in his introduction, that the Biden administration has already fingered big tech as a potential protective measure that we can take as the sort of arbiters of what is dangerous speech and what is not dangerous speech. And that's really interesting because that's, again, outsourcing the sort of that sort of arbitration to HR liberalism. And, it's, to Rachel's point, this is really frustrating because there are easier ways to deal with the consequences of institutional failure than drone strikes on American citizens. And what that sort of gets at is the left is uninterested in sort of equipping themselves to address those issues because they sort of reflexively dismiss, based on the ethos of that HR liberalism, all of the people who distrust government as bigots. And they did that with Bernie Sanders supporters too. If we remember the Bernie bro trope, which painted Bernie Sanders supporters as these sort of like basement dwelling, mouth breathing sexists. And that goes again to both sides of the sort of populist wave. And this is, I think, an opportunity, and to just kind of bring this full circle from where I started, I'm really curious if on the civil liberties front and on the sort of HR liberalism front, this is an opportunity for the Sanders left to come together with the Trump right and forge a new partnership in sort of fighting this kind of attempt to attack what they sort of overly broadly define as domestic terrorism. And that's not to say far right sort of militant QAnon or wherever. It's not to say it's not a threat. Of course it's a threat. We can debate the scope of it. But this sort of the drone strike notion, which is not, I don't think, widely accepted. Although if you gave a few drinks to somebody other than Nicole Wallace on the Never Trump side or on the left, you probably would get them to say, like, absolutely drone all of those West Virginians. But this is not exactly a widespread idea just yet. But this is, I think, perhaps a huge opportunity for another left-right partnership. And actually, on that note, Rachel, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida's new measures to go after the excesses of big tech, which is something that's, again, really interesting because the left is fueling it. The left is asking big tech to have more control over our lives, which is in such contradiction with historically the left's position on these corporate issues. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on with Governor DeSantis in Florida?
So, yeah, I think to set it up, every single day we see the threat from big tech grow. And by that, I don't just mean what the companies themselves are doing. I mean this fusion of corporate power with government power against citizens. And you see this every single day from the left now, not just, individual members of Congress, calling for tech to be broken up. No, they want to use that power. Joe Manchin, Michelle Obama, both called for Parler's deplatforming, both called for Trump's deplatforming. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez treats Twitter like her own personal editing service. She doesn't like her previous tweets that are now circulating in response to current events. She asks Twitter to take them down, and she tells them to ban hashtags criticizing her. Right? These are people that want to use corporate power to solidify their own government power. And to the point that you made, Emily, they are outsourcing in a lot of ways a censorship activity, that is not unconstitutional when done by a private company, but would be if it was done by the government. And that's what makes this so dangerous. And I think, again, even to, this idea that we're going to rout out extremism by this partnership between government and tech. We are getting into very dangerous territory. And so I think all of the concentrated power in big tech has to be dealt with. The federal level, the federal legislators have to deal with this. There is no more just complaining about it. There's no more chest thumping at hearings. We are now in the phase where policy solutions are required. But what I think is really interesting is that you're actually starting to see a lot of solutions bubble up from the states as well. And so Governor Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, really has made his name, I think, in a balanced approach to coronavirus, has kept his state open while balancing very, significant public health measures. Last week came out with an agenda on big tech that I think is extremely significant and creative. The hallmark to me of it was its creativity. And it starts with fining tech companies $100,000 a day if they ban politicians from their platforms. It gives his attorney general a wide latitude to bring cases against big tech companies for unfair and deceptive practices, which is really interesting and a creative approach. Basically, it says, look, you can't advertise one thing. You can't call yourself a free speech platform, and we're not going to do all these things and then go around and do the opposite. There may be a claim to be made there. He also requires disclosures from these companies. If you ban certain political speech, well, you have to disclose that as an in-kind campaign donation to the other side. So there's a host of other measures that he's proposed, and I don't know that all of them will stand up to scrutiny. I'll toss that one over to Josh if he thinks they will. But I think what the base really wants to see is this kind of aggressive, creative effort to take on, what is really becoming a threat, not just a threat to speech, a threat to liberty in very substantial ways. And so, look, I would expect more. I would hope more governors would follow DeSantis. Anyone who has national aspirations at this point has to be able to take on big tech. So, Josh, I don't know if you want to speak to kind of from the legal side of things, if you think these measures have any merit.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Just to go back real quick, I kind of only am now realizing that I didn't actually address kind of the law of the previous segment. Just a real quick note, 20 seconds here. One thing that I'll be looking for on the domestic extremism front, I am looking to see if the libertarian legal shops, the Cato Institutes of the world, the Institutes for Justice, if they wake up from their COVID era slumber, where there's been shockingly little litigation against these draconian lockdowns, whether they wake up if this actually escalates. So that's the one point I want to make in the previous segment. But going back to Ron DeSantis and what he's doing here and kind of legal ramifications here, the in-kind election contribution thing is actually deeply fascinating. Going back to October, after the whole New York Post Hunter Biden disaster, Senator Hawley called for an FEC, Federal Election Commission investigation into whether or not there was an in-kind contribution made, by Facebook and Twitter to the Biden-Harris campaign. I don't recall that actually ended up going anywhere, but it's really good to see that kind of idea getting momentum again. One thing specifically that Governor DeSantis is kind of starting to roll out here is he's talking about old school consumer protection fraud statutes. These go back to the common law. These go back to kind of 15th, 16th century English common law. We have always had fraud consumer protection statutes ever since we've had the idea of a corporation in the first place. And I can't tell you, just in kind of like my lawyer life, how many conversations I've had with conservative leaning lawyers who are saying, why are they talking about Section 230, all this stuff for? And I'm not downplaying Section 230. I think that's part of the equation here. But I've just had a lot of private conversation with people saying, at a state level, not a federal, at a state level, we have these fraud statutes. When are people going to start talking about it? So that was amazing for me to see Governor DeSantis start to do that. And, another thing that I find so fascinating, and he's obviously kind of angling himself for 2024 here, Governor DeSantis, going back to his days as a congressman, I'm a longtime fan of the guy, but he's not exactly kind of like a true kind of like Josh Hawley-esque populist in his bones. He doesn't have like a paper trail of writing going back 12 years talking about kind of Aristotelian conceptions of justice over free market fundamentalism, which, Hawley does have. DeSantis he's a little bit more of kind of a very conservative Republican, but a bit more of a standard Republican, if you will. So to see him coming out this strongly is really increasingly think this is going to be an issue that unifies the Republican Party, at least rhetorically. Substantively, obviously, we always know that, especially at a federal level, congressmen are always kind of behind where their constituents are on these various issues. But at least rhetorically, it seems to me that this is an increasingly unifying issue for the right of center in America. And, look, we do need an all of the above strategy, both at the state level and then at the federal level. We're recording this on Tuesday. Just this morning, I received a shockingly good op-ed from former Senator Orrin Hatch. So by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be up on the website. Orrin Hatch is calling for public accommodation or common carrier regulation for the tech companies. He's calling for effectively a digital bill of rights where you can sue if the tweet that was taken down would have been first man protected. These are what we might call high energy solutions. And this is Orrin Hatch, kind of like the definition of an establishment Republican. So I am increasingly optimistic about the future of the right of center on this issue. Ben or Emily, not sure if you share my optimism on that, though.
Well, I'll jump in here just to say, I think it was really interesting that you pointed out DeSantis is not sort of a nationalist or an economic populist in his bones. And that resonates with me as somebody who really came of age during the Tea Party era and somebody who does firmly believe in limited government. And I think there are better ways for the Trump right to talk about government because what you hear from a lot of people who support some of these really anti-establishment ideological priorities, some of which are great, others of which I'm really hesitant to sort of jump on board with. And some of the measures against tech are a good example of that. Again, as somebody who is generally hesitant to say, yes, let's have the federal government step in and tell this private company how it should be doing business. Of course, monopolies sort of play into that in a different sense. And a lot of these companies do enjoy monopolies. But when you look at what Ron DeSantis is doing on a state level, I think it's, to Rachel's point, and to maybe sort of synergize what both of you are saying, there's something really creative and really innovative about what Ron DeSantis did on the state level that I think can make sort of limited government conservatives like myself, who do believe that the government establishment and the bureaucracy crushes innovation and crushes creativity and, directs markets in an unproductive way, that can sort of take people like that and make them comfortable with the attempts to rein in big tech and their power. Ben, what are your thoughts on the steps DeSantis took?
Yeah, so I would make 2 points. The first is going back to Rachel's introduction to this issue. She talked about, I think she termed it the fusion of government power and corporate power. And there's a word for that, and that's fascism. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that. The other side would say it about actual, truly libertarian, free market, free enterprise. They would say that's a fascistic system, probably. This is actually fascism. So anyone who is in the game and engaged on behalf of forgotten Americans, their constituents, and even their non-constituents, better take a stance against this. So I look forward to Governor DeSantis getting an endorsement from Antifa in the coming days. But all that said, first of all, he should be lauded for this, regardless of whether the legal merits and practically how this ultimately plays out. Some of this is probably more a nuisance for the tech companies, but it's also signaling to them that more could be coming. And on the second point, and to your point, Emily, regarding sort of the federalism argument here, there may be a path forward in terms of the states pursuing the big tech companies. And you could foresee an alliance of dozens of states, Republican-led states, potentially taking measures in a variety of areas on top of what Governor DeSantis put forth. Also, in terms of protecting and preserving free and open ideological discourse, non-discrimination against people on ideological grounds. And there are laws on the books in certain states, including even California, that do touch on these issues. So I agree with Josh. We need an all of the above approach. If the states can push forward in a way that the federal government cannot, I think that's a very positive, valuable thing. It's also interesting that this is Florida, a state which is increasingly serving as a magnet for people in big tech and beyond to come there. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out ultimately. But I think the most important thing is what we're seeing, in my view, is not truly a free market. I would not argue that these companies have attained the positions that they have attained as a consequence of free and open competition. In fact, they have, in effect, been given subsidies by the government. They have been pressed by the government to suppress the First Amendment by proxy, and that's a clear and present danger to our entire constitutional order. So any moves that can be taken against them, I think, are valuable on their face, regardless ultimately of how this plays out over time.
You know, I'm going to take this next segment, and it actually relates to both of the previous segments. And as we often find on NatCon Squad, there's this thread woven through all of our topics and everything that we discuss. I want to talk about what I referred to in the introduction as a deeply weird piece of journalism from Time. And that was written by Molly Ball, who's sort of a celebrated, purported neutral arbiter of the facts in the corporate press. And this article talked about, quote, a well-funded cabal. That's a quote. And it's sort of nodding to the irony, and she continues sort of winks at this notion that what she's reporting on is ironic. So she says this well-funded cabal, she chronicles how that well-funded cabal came together to prevent Donald Trump from winning the 2020 election by mustering legal efforts and efforts to contact tech and efforts to coordinate favorable media coverage through this multi-layer campaign that brought together elites in all of those powerful sectors, media, tech, and in the courts, in a way that would hinder Donald Trump from becoming president. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to this story. One thing that I want to mention is in the headline, it talks about, it straight up says how they, quote, saved the 2020 election, which means the story is coming from the assumption and is operating based on the predicate that what these elites did was positive and was saving the country. So that's a built-in, baked-in, strong bias to begin with. And second of all, it talks about how they wanted the story to be told. And Time then gave them the sort of silver platter to display their accomplishment on, and did it in a very friendly way and said, absolutely, let's help you talk about how you saved the Republic. It didn't save the Republic, of course. So it basically would be what Hillary Clinton might have referred to as interference. And whichever candidate you wanted to prevail in 2020, this notion that a host of elites would, think they're saving the Republic by coming together and bragging about their well-funded cabal that did everything they could to tip the scales in one direction or the other. It's absolutely insane. And let me start with Josh asking, if this had been something like people on the right were sort of mired in speculation. Some of it was way too conspiratorial and some of it was literal. And we're being told they couldn't talk about what happened in the 2020 election. We're told they couldn't talk about how every sort of facet of our institutions was working in one direction and how there seemed to be coordination. Time magazine just comes out and says it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess as the opinion editor of Newsweek, Time's arch rival for probably like 60, 70 years, I probably should be in a position of trashing our competitor. And I certainly will be in this particular segment because this is just awful. Look, journalism in America in the year 2021 is obviously in a particularly putrid, rotten state. But the double standard here, as you say, Emily, is just beyond off the charts. I think back to a column I wrote a couple of weeks ago after the whole GameStop fiasco, which we discussed obviously in a previous podcast, about how just wherever you look, it seems like societal elites, the ruling class, whatever kind of nomenclature you want to use, it seems like they are seeking to rig the game. And this is obviously just a very clear example of that. I mean, we on the right are not allowed to air any clear, any non-conspiratorial, any like quote unquote mainstream concerns about mail-in balloting or anything like that, while those on the left are allowed to just literally openly flaunt the fact that they effectively colluded from one step down to the next one to secure American integrity or secure democracy or whatever you want to do it. I mean, look, if you want to call this stealing an election, I, for one, will not be one who is going to correct you, okay? The hashtag Stop the Steal and all of that was probably a little overboard, but when you read articles like this one, you really do get the sense that this was just a top-down effort to secure their vision. Now, obviously, we don't want to relitigate the election. It's over. There's no point in any of that. I think the better conversation for us going forward is what we do to stop this moving forward. Now, one thing that that I had, and something that I pushed a little bit and will continue to push in future articles, is Republicans, if they have one kind of proverbial mandate from all of this, they really need to unify around a message of ending mail-in balloting and ending early voting just in general, to the extent it is even remotely feasible. Obviously, there will always be dispensations, exceptions, active service military, bedridden, elderly. There's any number of exceptions to any rule as in general in law. But if Republicans can rally around just a one-day national election, if you want to call it, if you want to make it a national holiday for equitable reasons, I don't have a particularly huge issue with that. That simply has to be a unifying rally cry going forward. There are all sorts of kind of longstanding, by the way, issues with the entire notion of early voting, kind of preceding all the prolific and destabilizing mail-in balloting. I mean, early voting just is kind of like a basic rule, kind of, at least from my perspective. I'm curious if anyone disagrees with this. From my perspective, it just completely botches the meaning of an election, which is supposed to be a snapshot in time and as a referendum and not kind of a moving target. So anyway, I really hope Republicans come to the table with concrete legislative solutions, whether it's policy, whether it's constitutional amendments, whether it's something to try and prevent this happening from happening again. But for now, just the reeking double standard, where we can't talk about the problems of mail-in balloting, but they can effectively write these puff pieces in Time magazine and kind of put two proverbial middle fingers just in the face of right-leaning readers. It's just pretty galling and appalling, I think.
So Ben, given what Josh, I think, just accurately said, which is that we're not even allowed to talk about this problem, and the inevitable challenges to questions of voting integrity are that Republicans are bigoted and racist. Given all of that, how can this be addressed going forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, the paradigm should be flipped around on the people who claim that it's voter suppression to actually have rigorous voter integrity standards put in place. It's dilution and suppression when you have illegal voters canceling out legal ones, when you continually remove the person from the voting booth and push them further and further away so that someone can influence them. And we might see ballot harvesting or pressuring on people or payoffs and the like that might transpire to the extent we continue to have elections like we had in 2020 in perpetuity. And the first point I want to make is everyone should be laser focused on the fact that there's a bill, HR 1, which was the first bill introduced the prior term of Congress, which would essentially enshrine in federal law, not only federalizing elections, but imposing on the states essentially all of the flaws that we saw this time around in terms of mass mail-in voting, in terms of loose signature verification standards and the like, again, under the guise of what you just mentioned, this propaganda about it being voter suppression and the like. So that's the first bill out of the House, and there's a Senate companion to that as well. And I would urge everyone to at least read the Cliff Notes, because I think it's a 791-page bill or something like that. But it is larded with essentially all of the most egregious aspects of this election being put forth potentially in perpetuity. So that's number one on the immediate survival front of this. A separate observation that I would make is it's humorous, but in sort of a dark way, that for so long we heard there was no deep state, and then you had, I think, the Washington Post and maybe the New York Times would come out with these articles. Actually, there is a deep state, and here's what it's doing to protect you. It's the exact same thing with this. There is no conspiracy to rig the election. Well, actually, all of these institutions of power are working in tandem, essentially to try to disenfranchise half the country. So there's the narrow but major issue of, are we going to be stuck with elections like 2020 in perpetuity, with the precedent set and now a clear majority of Democrats in the House and an arguable majority of Democrats in the Senate as well? And then there's a broader question of, what do we do when all of these institutions are working against everything that we believe in to our core? So we have half the country, the forgotten Americans, who are ideologically aligned with us, but all the power centers are controlled by our worst adversaries. The Trump administration itself had trouble grappling with this issue with a bureaucracy that was pretty much 99% at the president's throat. This is a long-term problem for us, which is, what do we do with these rotten institutions?
What do we do, Rachel? Are we stuck with this in perpetuity? What does 2022, what does 2024 look like? And what can be done to prevent us from sort of just accepting this sloppy election precedent as our new normal?
Well, I think it goes to something Josh alluded to, which is that the right does not organize power effectively. It's like the one thing we just don't do well. And there's a lot of reasons for that, probably the last 30 years of ideological framing. But this is an area where our survival could easily be stamped out if we don't actually organize around sort of dealing with this election problem. I think one of the most frustrating things to me about this current, or the 2020 election, was that we saw the threat coming, right? Like, we knew that even if you take all of the conspiracy theories out of it, there were obviously going to be irregularities over a massive mail-in voting election. Like, that baseline, that's self-evident. We knew this was going to be a problem, and we really didn't do anything. We didn't organize around it. We didn't send people to the states. We just didn't have our legal capabilities together to address these issues when they arose. Hence why I think a lot of the voter fraud cases that were brought were thrown out on not on the merits, but on technicalities. We just weren't prepared, I think, to address this. And that can be no longer. Right? The left has completely organized itself around changing elections in America to ensure that they win every single time, that the right never has any meaningful power ever again. We cannot allow this. And this goes beyond just sort of protecting ourselves at the legislative, at the federal level. It is actually aggressing in the states. It's having voter integrity units, around. It's meeting the left where they are. Right? They are shameless in how they talk about this. The Time article is shameless in that regard. So I think this has to be a priority for Republicans in a way that it just hasn't been. I think we talk a lot about election integrity, like somehow it'll materialize on its own. No, we have to be sort of birthing it ourselves. And so this is the project for Republicans, and it should be the number one priority for Republicans for the next 4 years for survival alone. So I think it's really important that we do this organizationally as well as legislatively.
What's ironic from my perspective is, and this is something that we on the right, I think, have oftentimes warned about, every time that the left, the ruling class, the institutions of both public and private power in America, every time they kind of flaunt their stuff like this, every time they kind of shove it down their throats and put it in our face, all that is going to do is make people on the right angrier. It's going to make them feel like they are like the elites are more out of touch, like the game is more rigged. If the people on the left, if kind of the semi-liberal left wants to tone down kind of this more like nationalist populist uprising, I'm using that term kind of in jest, obviously, but they want to kind of tone down this movement. Literally, the worst thing they can do is publish articles like this Time magazine piece. So that to me is just the total irony here. But that's actually a great segue, now that I think about it, for our final segment, is kind of the rise of kind of wokeism and illiberalism and the various institutions of power in America. A friend of NatCon Squad and NatCon Talk, I guess our kind of sister program, Dave Rubin, had a very interesting tweet thread over the weekend. Dave wrote a whole book basically defending liberalism, basically defending kind of more kind of like classical Lockean conception of free speech, kind of pluralism, proceduralism, kind of just like true kind of Enlightenment liberalism. Dave obviously is very anti-woke, But he's very much kind of part of the a term that hasn't been used in a while, the so-called intellectual dark web, with folks like Jordan Peterson and Barry Weiss, folks who are anti-woke, but are not necessarily kind of Josh Hawley-esque populists, I guess, either. But Dave Rubin had a really interesting Twitter thread over the weekend where he effectively concluded, and he said this was no small deal for him, given that he literally wrote a whole book on this. He concluded that secular liberalism specifically has failed. This obviously has been a recurring debate, especially on kind of the post-Trump right for a handful of years now. Patrick Deneen, the Notre Dame political philosopher, wrote a book in 2018 called Why Liberalism Failed. At Newsweek, where I'm the opinion editor, I actually held a debate of the week on this subject way back last summer between Patrick Deneen and Jonah Goldberg. So this issue has been constantly debated. But effectively, what Dave Rubin says in this tweet thread, and obviously, I'd encourage all the listeners and viewers to check it out themselves, is he basically says that secular liberalism, by being too open, fails to contain itself, that it is necessarily kind of embedded and ingrained in the very equation that will give rise to Marxism, to wokeism, to what Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology, all this nonsensical cancel culture that we're seeing across all the various institutions in America. And look, this is NatCon Squad. This is a production of the Edmund Burke Foundation, and the head honcho of organization, of course, is Yoram Hazony, who is a ferocious critic of liberalism. And it seems to me like we have a lot of kind of erstwhile kind of true believing, mother's milk imbibing old school liberals who are kind of coming to see the light here. Now, the question, of course, is whether this is true. And if so, what we actually do about it from a public policy perspective. I think a lot of the critics of liberalism would suggest that nationalism, religion, these are some of the things that are actually needed, not just in kind of the private spheres of influence, but actually as a matter of public policy and as a matter of law. On the latter front, as a matter of law, that's kind of a side project of mine. I'm kind of developing this new theory of jurisprudence that I call common good originalism, that is kind of centered around all of this as trying to allow judges and legislators to do this in a constitutionally legitimate fashion. But look, this is a big deal, guys. I mean, Dave Rubin kind of coming out saying secular liberalism has failed. It really, I think, should be a wake-up call for a lot of folks out there. So I'm not sure if anyone else has thoughts on Dave's thread and kind of where we on the right go from here.
This is something I was thinking about fairly recently when I actually interviewed an economist from the Brookings Institution on a study that Brookings released in November, documenting exactly what the gap looked like between some of the most major corporations in this country, Amazon, Walmart, in their sort of soaring profits over the course of 2020, and then what their frontline workers, people who, whatever you think of this public health crisis, were not allowed to sort of kick it on Zoom meetings from 9 to 5 for months on end, and why there was such a huge gap, why somebody like Jeff Bezos was increasing his net worth by the billions, and not sort of, here's a word I'm not going to use, redistribute, but not sort of putting that money towards the workers in a way that like just a tiny fraction of where his wealth has grown. You could have distributed that to people who are actually risking it, not kicking it on Zoom. And you can look at sort of Amazon, you can look at Walmart, and you can look at places like Target and Best Buy that actually did manage to do that. This is all according to that Brookings study, which folks can check out. And I was thinking about this in the context of that our elite class is so thoroughly godless. They are guided by moral relativism and postmodernism in a way that's really difficult, because when you have free markets, you should, of course, unless you're like a Randian and totally objectivist, you can sort of see how a common sense of morality and sort of shared moral standards would guide us as consumers and as CEOs and executives towards at least a manageable or in a manageable sort of capitalist economy and a broader American morality. But when you have this elite class that is guided not by God, but by this total secularism, this cult of cultural leftism, which is rooted in postmodernism, That's where we're getting into really, really difficult territory. And it's hard for me, like, to the extent there's a thread that goes through all of our conversations today, we're at the spool, in my opinion, and it's hard for me to sort of see how that could ever turn around.
Yeah, briefly, I would just make a couple points. The Constitution, just like all of our institutions, we may have the best laws written for them, but if you don't have people who actually believe in the laws and the bases for those laws, it all gets corrupted. The Constitution isn't worth the paper that it's printed on if it doesn't have a virtuous people who are willing to defend it, who care about the Judeo-Christian, Western, classically liberal principles that and values that undergird it. Similarly, there's an analog to this, which is that in every place where communism has arisen, the communists first target religiosity. And there's a reason for that, because when you demoralize a people, you destabilize them, and it allows you to usurp and accrete power. So I think the first thing is, like, the notion of God, family, and country. The God and family are really important, or you don't have the country ultimately. And again, we shouldn't be afraid of saying that. And so I think that ultimately, whether or not secular liberalism itself is bound to fail, because it's essentially content-free liberalism. And if you put liberals up against leftists, the leftists are always going to win. I think there's an argument to be made for it. And maybe you can look at our so-called cooperation and engagement with communist China as the perfect sort of personification of how this is played out. But it's very clear that if we aren't operating from a common set of values, principles, core underlying ways of organizing ourselves, our lives, our families, our communities, we are not going to have a nation. And ultimately, we're not going to survive in the face of nations that want to be the dominant ones.
What do you think, Rachel?
I'm kind of two minds about this a little bit, because, it's interesting. I do think this presents a moment for conservatives, right? Because conservatism, I think, is well equipped for this. You talk about Edmund Burke. Burke functionally really understood sort of the need for a transcendent moral order, for a need for sort of the slow sort of transformative change, instead of the rapid, rebirth and undoing of everything he witnessed in the French Revolution. And that's kind of where we are, I think, a little bit. And I share some of Josh's maybe depressed attitude about how we come out of it, because I do think, so much of what I see now, I'm like, are we in late stage Rome? I think we might be in the decline. Like, this is what the boomers have left us with. The triumph of the id, right, is actually like what we're living through. But then, I do travel a fair amount and speak at different organizations, and it always shocks me that everyone else outside of sort of the elite coastal bubbles that we live in currently fundamentally or intuitively understands what's happening, right? And they are sort of intuitively a little bit more conservative in that way, that they do sort of understand the concept of the little platoon and taking care of your community, and the existential nexus between, country and God and family, that all those things are needed for the country to survive. The question is, do those people still have a voice? And that's what I think is the unanswered question here. We just talked about how our elections, right, are maybe don't matter as much. That is how the people speak. Do they still have a way to communicate, I think, those values to the people that represent them? That, I think, is what gives me, I'm not as optimistic, I think, that those people will still have a voice, right? They're being ruled, right? The chasm between the rulers and the ruled on this question is a big one.
I think back to Matthew Schmitz, who's an associate editor at First Things magazine, had a really excellent essay at Tablet magazine back in September, I think it was, basically saying that, we talk on the show sometimes about, whether kind of old school Cold War era fusionism is still kind of a viable political coalition or political philosophy in the 21st century. One thing that Matthew Schmitz wrote in this essay at Tablet was he basically proposed kind of a new, purely tactical fusionist alliance, if you will, between traditionalists, evangelicals, devout Catholics, Orthodox Jews, et cetera, and kind of the unwoke liberals. And he speculates that could, it's purely tactical, there's kind of nothing like broadly philosophical or substantive that underpins this. But if they can kind of unite against kind of what Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology, and defeat Marxism, which is what this is, we're really just watching kind of modern illiberalism is really just kind of one flavor, one variety of the old school kind of Marxist struggle. That is kind of one possible path forward. But, Ben, just to your point, every time that these communist, socialist, Marxist sympathizers kind of rise to power, and we're really not being hyperbolic here, that is quite literally what we're seeing. I use those terms quite deliberately, actually. They really do kind of come after religion first. One of my favorite data points on this, I think back to when I was in law school. I was chairman of a conservative debating society that shares a figure with this foundation. It was called the Edmund Burke Society. And one debate that we held was about no-fault divorce. And I was doing a little research to prepare my speech for that debate. And I was just stunned to discover that no-fault divorce was literally developed by a Soviet Bolshevik era social theorist. Now, look, I'm not necessarily opining on no-fault divorce in the year 2021. I think reasonable people, even on the right, can probably disagree about that, but that is kind of the origin, the provenance of that particular policy. So look, it seems to me that that conservatives, Republicans, there's kind of this emerging consensus that, Wall Street Journal editorial board kind of tax cuts for the wealthy, capital gains tax cuts. It's just not necessarily the end all be all of what it means to be a conservative. When folks like Dave Rubin are waking up to that realization, it seems to me that we are heading in the right direction. So I actually am slightly more optimistic, perhaps, than I indicated earlier, just because it seems to me like when Dave is there, then we're kind of all getting there. But we're pretty much out of time. Oh, sorry, Emily, you want to jump in?
No, I was going to say, let's go around the virtual room and wrap up with any final thoughts that we all have here. And I'll start with Ben, actually, and then I'll move to Josh and then to Rachel.
Yeah, so just to follow up on Josh's last point, I think the reason that religiosity is the first thing targeted is because it's the greatest stumbling block to those who wish to control us, to make man God and enslave us under the church of state wokedom as it is now, because they need to blot out any belief in a higher purpose that transcends sort of the material realm that we're operating in. So they need to blot out idealism from materialism ultimately to triumph. I think the broader point, if I try to link everything that we discussed today, is that there's a clear concerted effort to use every lever of power for whatever we want to call it, the ruling class is the term I like to use, to put forth their prerogatives, to retain their power, to grow their power. And we need to be just as organized, just as strategic, pursue them in this kind of multi-pronged fashion, just as they pursue us. And I'd say this starts with small steps, and that ultimately leads to big leaps. And it starts with, I believe, taking back the language and speaking clearly, frankly, truthfully, and courageously in the face of their tyranny. That gives other people courage. So speaking openly and honestly about the stakes of what's transpiring, what is actually transpiring, is imperative. And hopefully this show provides a little bit of that and will instill courage in the others who listen to it and watch it.
That reminds me, none of us have given our pronouns. Oh, okay, Josh, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, look, we've covered a lot on this show, as we tend to do on these podcasts. But I kind of think back to what I was saying during our segment on the Time magazine article, which is just the irony that the ruling class, whatever you want to call it, and like Ben, I oftentimes use the term ruling class in my writing. I think it kind of just sticks the landing well. But if the ruling class wants to kind of, and this is the problem, okay? The problem here, and I'm kind of arriving at this problem in real time. The problem is that if the ruling class wanted to quell tensions, they want to subdue America, if they wanted kind of more of a stable equilibrium, anything remotely resembling kind of a pluralistic, we'll hear all sides perspective, they wouldn't do things like publish that Time magazine article where they're literally just flaunting and dancing and rubbing it in our face. The problem is, I don't think that's what the ruling class wants. They are angling for something potentially very nasty. They really are, and that kind of takes us back to our first segment, the domestic extremism. They want conflict, and you know what? We try on the show to not kind of give in to the negativity and the pessimism. We try to provide kind of a constructive, forward-thinking brand of conservatism, which gets us to our last segment there. And I think that would be kind of the bare bones beginning. This kind of I'm not even quite use the term post-liberal. It's a very kind of controversial term in modern conservative discourse, but something that is more than just kind of free market fundamentalism, more than just kind of laissez-faire conservatism. That strikes me as a necessary, albeit not sufficient, initial baby step to take for the deplorables to kind of stand up against this tyrannical ruling class regime.
Final thoughts, Rachel?
Yeah, I think Josh is exactly right there. And it's interesting, as you know, the post-Cold War fusionism is breaking down and a new one is arising. And I think what that looks like, the contours of that are still being determined. But I think to sort of put a finer point on how the last sort of consensus has failed us is something that Josh said earlier, which I just think is so instructive. We are living in a moment where literally people on cable news are like, should we drone strike Trump supporters? There's a wall around the Capitol. You know, big tech is fusing with big government, which is literal fascism, as Ben pointed out. And the libertarians are silent. Like, no one at Reason Magazine has realized it yet, but this is the libertarian moment, right? And they have been such a core component of the fusionism on the right. And yet, when we are living in a moment of abject tyranny on so many levels, they're nowhere to be found. And so I think that is just one little anecdote that I think displays and illustrates how this sort of cultural and political fusionism is rebuilding itself. And I think it's going to rebuild itself around a more, again, to Josh's point, less of a reflexive clinging to free markets as the antidote to every crisis that we face, and more of, what does a limited government, not no government, but what does limited government look like in a way, where conservatives can actually use power when they have it in a meaningful way, but that protects family, that protects, religion, that protects, what it is that we want to, how we want to live together, the outer bounds of the social order, because that is what government ultimately should be concerned with. So I think you're starting to see that take place. And, I think it's exciting. I know we're living through some trying times, but I think it's a very exciting time to be a part of this movement.
So that is a unplanned but totally perfect segue into briefly my final thought, which is, as I was kind of considering what I was reflecting on when I interviewed the Brookings economist about that study, it's that, how do you square this circle where if I were Jeff Bezos and I had increased my net worth by billions over the course of a pandemic and not given much of that to the people who weren't kicking it on Zoom and were getting out of bed every day at 6 a.m. and going to deliver packages or to a facility to package the packages, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night because I am a Christian, and that would be really hard for me to square with my values. Now, I don't know Jeff Bezos's personal faith. I sort of doubt that it's sort of easy to see based on his actions. It would be easy to question based on his actions whether he's in sort of that vein. And I genuinely wouldn't be able to sleep at night. And I think if we had more people, that's not to say I'm such a benevolent and decent and kind human being. I am all of those things and so much more. Kidding. But if we had more people that were sort of beholden to their local church community in positions of power around the country, I think we would see different actions from the ruling class. And now it's sort of, we have to square this circle of believing that there is this overly secular cult of cultural leftism running our ruling class, but we also believe in markets and the creativity and innovation that they produce. And we're staring down the barrel of an inability to even talk about our elections because the cultural leftism is such a strong monopoly in all of these different arenas. And so it does feel like we're sort of wrapped in this impossible situation, but it's one that we are talking through every single week to the best of our ability. So on that note, I want to say on behalf of Rachel and Josh and Ben, thank you so much for being with us on NatCon Squad today. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we'll see you at the next episode of NatCon Squad.